Okay, so I'll call to order our work session. So we don't normally have work sessions in the council chambers, but there was interest by Councilor King today. In the future, council, if you have interest in moving the location of a work session, could you please do it when the council packet comes out as opposed to the day of the council so that it gives our staff an opportunity to really set it up and have it available for everyone. I don't have a problem with a change in venue. I think it's great for everybody to get to feel comfortable, but it is respectful of our staff to give them an opportunity to have some time to set it up. So, Joe?
So the other request that Councilor King made that we're doing, we are videotaping this work session, just like you may recall when we did the work session on the police staffing study. We held it in this room and we videotaped because there's obviously great interest in the topic we're going to talk about tonight. We will post that separately from the council meeting so people that they don't have to scroll through the council meeting and go directly to this work session. The PowerPoint that Mr. Pessimir is going to go through, which the council is going to receive packets, we'll post that tomorrow as well online. We didn't know how many people would show up and didn't want to make a bunch of copies of something and too many. So we'll make those available tomorrow to the public like we've done in the past. So this work session is largely going to be led by Mr. Pessimir. Just for clarity, one of the many hats that he wears as the assistant city manager is as our HR director. So when it talks about staffing decisions and positions and things like this, it falls within his jurisdiction. He's done a tremendous amount of work over the last few months in response to the proposals from the sheriff's office. Chief Growth is going to be very involved with this conversation. He also worked very closely with Mr. Pessimir, looking at different schedules and alternatives and bouncing ideas off each other. So those two staff are going to be the primary leaders of this discussion. We do have folks from the sheriff's office that Tom will introduce that are here to talk about the proposals they've provided. I have a feeling that council members may have some specific questions about, well, how would that work if the sheriff's office did this? And how would you handle this? And they're here to answer those questions. This is a work session, just as a reminder. This is largely for the city council to be educated and to ask questions. It is not a public hearing. There is no public testimony. There's no chance really for the public to weigh in pro or con. This is an educational step with the council. So any other general questions? I don't know how long you want to go, Mayor and Council, in terms of this could easily take a good hour, hour and a half. So I think if you want to take a break, that's fine. Or if you want to cut it off and continue at a later date, we can do that.
Yeah, and so, and to remind, we don't make decisions in work sessions. We're here to gather some information so that we can ponder it, talk to other residents about it, and we appreciate the sheriff's coming today to give us some great information, and so let's hear it.
Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Pessimir from here on out.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was actually a great introduction, and I guess I'll just add to that this really is a lot of information. There's a ton of information contained in this presentation. It's a fraction of the amount of information that we considered, but I tried to put together as much as I could to try to lay out a story, as well as give you the pertinent information to at least start thinking about decisions and seeing where this conversation might go down the road. So with that, I'm going to just go ahead and start. Hopefully that came up on your screens. I also did pass out a paper copy to each of you at the break, just so you could have something to scribble notes on and have that information handy. As Joe mentioned, we'll post this entire presentation online tomorrow morning. So if anybody wants to see it now, or if they watch this later, they can go online and get this information as well. So really, tonight's presentation, I'll give you a brief history of how we got here. We are going to have the Washington County Sheriff's Office come and discuss the proposals that they made. That'll be Chief Deputy John Cook and John Shaver will come up and kind of walk through the proposal so you can ask them questions directly about what those are and what they're not. And they can give you the best information that you can get. A lot of staff analysis and data has been put together. It's in the packet, and I'll go through that fairly slowly so that hopefully you understand at least what we did. And then finally, really just asking some questions and figuring out what the next steps will be moving forward. So the history, really, March of 2016, this year, Matrix Consultant Group finishes the staffing study. And in May of this year, a majority of council directed staff to look at the recommendation number 6 of the staffing study. And I'll go over that recommendation here in just a minute. We contacted the Washington County Sheriff's Office with a request. They provided 3 options for consideration, which they'll go over here in a few minutes. Then we went into a process of taking the information they gave us, the information we had from the matrix analysis, and put that all together and put it in a presentation for you guys tonight. So recommendation number 6, as a Sherwood Police Department patrol staffing alternative, as a Sherwood Police Department patrol staffing alternative, contact the Washington County Sheriff to collectively explore Washington County Sheriff Office patrol coverage of Sherwood during the 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. time frame. This could result in a reallocation of night shift, graveyard, officer, and sergeant staff to other Sherwood Police Department assignments, and thus mitigate the need for additional staff resources as recommended in this report. So if you remember right, Matrix did a complete staffing study. This was one of many recommendations that they made, but this was the one that we were asked to kind of take and kind of tease out, so to speak, and see if there was something to this recommendation and just see where that was go, and that's what this presentation is about tonight. So we did contact the Washington County Sheriff's Office. You can't see that, that's okay. I've got a slide that summarizes it here in just a second. But this is what they gave us. They gave us 3 different proposals to take a look at. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John Cook and John Shaver to kind of go over what those proposals were and what exactly they mean.
Good evening, Mayor and council members. First of all, I want to extend the sheriff's apologies for not being able to attend tonight. He had some family engagements that he couldn't get away from. So we will do our best to kind of go through all of these proposals and explain those to you. When the sheriff's office was first approached by the city to look at coverage during certain nighttime hours, this was a little bit different contract than we partner with other communities on, where it wasn't a full service contract. It was for a specific set of time. So the first proposal that we looked at, I'll go through each of them and kind of explain the numbers to you. And if you have any questions throughout, feel free to let me know. But the first one that we looked at was the 2.1 FTE. We know that the city currently has 2 officers covering graveyard hours. And so that's what we were looking at. When we look at the 2.1, we were initially not sure how we were going to do a partial contract for certain hours. And so we were looking at our deputies having to respond from our Beaverton office up on Murray Road. And so we were accounting for some travel time on that first proposal. When we started looking deeper into it, we realized that we would be able to station a deputy or 2 full-time out of the Sherwood Police Department, and that would alleviate some of that travel time to and from our East Precinct. So that really got us to more the 1.75 and the 0.875 FTE, so I'll explain those to you. Starting for 1 FTE for those hours of 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. comes out to 0.875 FTE. And the way we get that number is looking at the amount of hours, that 5-hour time period, times 7 days a week. So that gives us the 35 hours that shift would cover. If we had 2 FTEs during that time frame, that would be the 1.75, just doubling the 0.875 FTE. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. So those are really the 2 numbers we're looking at. For us, the main pieces would be the 1.75 or the 0.875. And those are based on averages. All of our contracts are based on averages through our deputies, kind of amortizing out equipment, fuel, all of those pieces. And that's broken down in your other graphs. So as we go through the 1.75 FTE, I'll kind of explain a couple of the contract pieces. The first one is salary and benefits. That is very self-explanatory. That's the wages for the deputies that would be providing service during those hours. When we go down to the next piece, it's the shift differential, and this can be somewhat confusing. For most people, they think of shift differential as shift if you're working nighttime versus daytime. For the county contract services, what that shift differential is, that is a guaranteed deputy. And so the easiest way to explain that is some of the communities that we partner with where they may contract with one full-time deputy, they are guaranteed a deputy with that shift differential. That is a premium that they could ask for. So for example, if a community was contracting with myself as one full-time employee, there's a certain amount of time that I'm going to be gone in training, I'm going to be on vacation, I'm going to call in sick. With that shift differential, you're guaranteed that. So if that deputy calls in sick, there's an immediate backfill to that. And so the customer is guaranteed that employee for that time frame. And so for this particular contract, we feel that is essential, whether it's with 1 FTE or 2 FTE, to ensure that there's a continuity of service. And so that's where that shift differential comes in. And that is based on averages. The amount of average for our officers and our deputies that are calling in sick have training time, they're off on vacation, and that's how that number is, we drive that number. Any questions? Correct. So basically with the shift differential, there's no overtime cost. It is a guaranteed shift minimum that you're going to have a person, either 1 or 2 FTEs during that time frame. Any questions on that? So then when we go down to the next piece, materials and services is just that. It breaks down into the radios, the body armor, duty gear, range fees, ammunition, vehicle maintenance. So that deputy that comes either with that .875 or the 1.75 also comes with a vehicle, comes with a taser, comes with fuel, anything that deputy needs to perform their job. Computer, whenever there's updates to any of that equipment, that is already included in there. So there's no additional cost to the customer on that contract item. Any questions on that? And then when we go down to the indirect costs, that is another one that can be a little bit confusing. But for our contract services, when we supply a deputy in a contract service position, that deputy is focused on providing service to that community. In this example, where it would be during nighttime hours, it's not just, we know there's not a lot of calls for service, but it's also doing business checks, security checks, it's patrolling neighborhoods, and some of those other pieces. So that's all that deputy is focusing on. So those indirect costs come into all the other pieces. It's broken down on averages. It's a percentage of my time to oversee that deputy. It's a percentage of our county attorney's time, our county counsel's time. So if there's a lawsuit, he covers that employee. There's a piece in there for our HR to hire and train and do any personnel actions on that. So all those indirect costs cover all of those pieces for that deputy, and none of that is incurred by the city. Does that make sense? So that goes through our 3 contract options. And like I said, really, for us, operationally, there's the 1.75, which would be 2 FTEs during that time frame, which is $292,000. The .875, which is 1 FTE during that 1 to 6. Again, that's guaranteed 7 days a week, is the 146 cost. Any questions on that? Customer, any other piece you'd like explained on that?
Yeah, well, actually, we've had quite a bit of conversation about this, and I just want to make sure they kind of get the same information. So, .875 FTE is really, having one person here. Can you talk a little bit about how the backup happens for that, and just, where that comes from? I think it's important because we've had a lot of conversations in the past about officer safety and those other things. And so there's a couple things about the .875 FTE that, if you could talk about maybe, how that works and how if you do have someone here, they can be safe.
Okay. So again, that .875 is a pretty unique contract service idea for us. So as we kind of thought through this, we were trying to determine how would we deploy that .875 of a deputy. For us, the most efficient way would be to deploy that deputy out of Sherwood Police Department. So when they first came on for their shift, they would be able to work the rural areas around the city. During that 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., they would come in and cover the city for calls and extra services throughout the city. And then at the end of that 6 o'clock, they would go back to county, finish their duties, but again, working out of the PD. Some of the other pieces, we talk about officer safety and backup. We always have 24 hours a day staffing on our south operations, which incorporates the city of Sherwood, the rural areas around the city of Sherwood, and the urban areas up on Bull Mountain. So we always have deputies working those areas that would be providing backup to that deputy that would be patrolling the city. So our recommendation would be, if that was to be an option, that .875 would be to have our deputy, once they came on service, have them work off the sheriff's office operating net, radio net. And what that does is a couple things. First of all, it gives us 24 hours a day supervision. We have supervisors on 24 hours a day, 365 days a year that would be monitoring that deputy's actions in their service to make sure that they're getting adequate supervision. The second piece to that is it allows the other deputies that are working throughout the county during those hours to monitor the activities that are going on. So what we'll see a lot of times is we have deputies working in a variety of communities throughout Washington County. If one area starts to get busy, some of those deputies will start to move in that direction, kind of bring their zone a little bit more towards that geographic area, whether it's a city or one of the communities that we serve. So that would give them additional backup that is out there 24 hours a day.
Good. Yes.
Do we currently, don't we have outside, whether it's a city or a county police from other jurisdictions, don't they come in and assist us when necessary for like the incident in my neighborhood? A lot of people came over to our neighborhood. Do they charge us for their coming over to our neighborhood?
No,
Currently?
no, and we don't charge them. It's what we call a mutual aid agreement
Okay.
with all the agencies. So it works both ways, and nobody's charged.
So the same piece would occur for this deputy that was working during those hours. That mutual aid that would come in from other deputies throughout the county would not be, there'd be no charge incurred by that. That's, again, based on the mutual aid that the chief described.
So the other thing that I'll mention that we kind of talk about, especially if you're at that point 875 FTE, there is going to be some additional workload that probably will have to happen during the day shift. If you only have one person here, they're not going to be able to follow up on all the different calls and some other things. A little bit, my understanding is a little bit less with the 1.75, but there's still going to be some additional things that are just going to have to happen, which can't happen in the middle of the night, which are going to be additional responsibilities that get passed on to either the day or the evening shift. So I guess that was really the different proposals that they gave us. And then we've taken those proposals and we've done a lot of data analysis from there. So if you don't have any more questions, I'll kind of move into that portion. The one thing that really jumped out to me is, after we got the proposals and really started thinking about this a little bit more is, you're talking about a partial shift. You're talking about 5 hours, and so all of a sudden you really can't compare apples to apples on a cost basis because really you've now changed the schedule of what we currently have, which is 310 shifts. So I did a lot of analysis to try to come up with ways to compare the different shifts and what the impacts to adding the sheriff into the schedule would do. And so kind of the next step that I went to is I really went back to some of the information that Matrix gave us and then started to try to work on some scenarios in order to be able to compare different options to see if this made any sense. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through this here. And you can kind of see this is really kind of what our current situation is. And after talking with Jeff and Ty and others, we kind of decided that June 2016 was really kind of the best month to just kind of look at to get averages because it gives us real information regarding on average how many people are working in each time block per hour. And I used the time block per hour because I also have data for the Matrix study, which I'll show you here in a minute, so we can use that as a comparison tool. I also went back and I did take a look at the typical deployment just to see, make sure that June was actually reasonable metric to use and it was within 5%. So it made a lot of sense just to use that for a lot of different reasons. One thing I'll also point out is the data does include Sergeant's motor and the SRO in the calculations. So basically, if you take one of those squares, you can see, so for example, if you take Monday at 4 o'clock in the morning, you typically have 2.5 officers on average working that shift. then the other information that I had which came directly out of the Matrix study was calls for service. One thing that I'll note is if you take a look at the police literature, and I know Jeff knows this really well, is officers per thousands and call for services aren't really good metrics to be using for analyzing whether you have sufficient staffing and thing for stuff. That used to be kind of the way that it happened, but they found that you really need to dig deeper into the information because you need to look at the priority of calls, you need to take a look at the length of calls. There's a lot of other things that kind of come into account. But calls for service actually can be used for comparative purposes because we're really just comparing the same type of shifts across different alternatives that we took a look at. So I use the calls for service, but I also want to point out that it's not perfect. They, like I said, they don't take into account the priority call, they don't take into account the length of call. But for our purposes, I think to at least start to study this and figure out if this is a direction that we could potentially go, it made a lot of sense to use. So really, what I did is I took the number of calls per services, or the number of, so that's backwards. I took the number of calls for services and divided it by the number of officers. And that really gives you a ratio then to kind of compare how many calls for services you get. And it's kind of washing out up on the screen there a little bit. I don't know what it looks like in your computers, but I really wanted to kind of just highlight the extremes of the data. So the red, which is kind of a warm color, is really the high ratios. The greens are the very low. And it's kind of what you would expect. You see, in the middle of the night when there's very, very low call for service activity, not many calls per officer. And then as you move into the 4 o'clock to 7 o'clock time period, you have significant amount. So you're starting to see red. There's no magic to these numbers. I'm really just trying to show, the extremes of the data. There's nothing, at least that I know about literature that says something over 20 is something to be concerned about. I'm really just trying to point out, what's going on with the data so you can kind of see currently where we're at. So no surprise there. I think that's kind of what we heard in the Matrix studies. You have, quite a bit of capacity in the middle of the night and sometimes during the day where there's things get pretty busy. The other thing that I'll point out is because we're running 3 10s, you have 6 extra hours since it's a 24-hour day, where you have overlap. So if you take a look between the 1 o'clock and the 1300 and the 1500 or 1600 hours, you actually have day shift and swing shift, which are overlapping. As well as between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock, you have, or 11 o'clock, you have the night shift and the swing shift overlapping. So you can see those are kind of white or green because you have additional officers on because your shifts are actually overlapping and you have more people on. So you will see that as we move forward. The next thing I did is actually took that and compared it to the Matrix active study time. So when Matrix did their analysis, they looked at what was called proactive time, but they defined proactive time that was any time that wasn't active. So what I wanted to do was to see whether or not this calls for service model would actually make sense. So really just comparing it. And you can see, especially in the 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock time frame, there's a lot of correlation there. But you're seeing some things pop out in the 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock area, especially, on Monday, where you're not seeing that in the calls for service analysis. And that gets back to the fact that it's not taking into account the length of times it calls. Monday morning, you're probably having traffic accidents, you're having other things going on. So all of a sudden those calls are being longer. And so they had a lot more data that went into this. But relatively, what I was trying to do here was just to see, okay, does this make sense? And it does. I mean, there's a good correlation between the two. It's not perfect, but at least it does. And here's actually the comparison between the two, so you can kind of see what I was trying to get at. So the next step that kind of that I did was to really create a spreadsheet where we could move things around. So you could move officers around, you could move the percentages around, you could add officers back in, you could change the shifts. So basically trying to figure out, okay, is there any scenario here that actually works that makes it better than the graph on the left? Obviously, that's kind of where we started. We want to end up better overall, hopefully at the end. So, so did a lot of work to kind of do that. And we met, and then I think, after kind of looking at that and looking at different alternatives, Jeff kind of came up with a schedule that kind of made sense to him. And kind of was following where the data was leading us. So this next schedule is really an alternative patrol schedule. And as we go through kind of the rest of the conversation, that's kind of what we'll use. That doesn't mean that there aren't all sorts of other, possible patrol schedules out there. But, this actually kind of made a lot of sense. So first off, it eliminates the night shift, which, you're having the sheriff come in for 5 hours. That's what was Matrix's recommendation, is you would eliminate that shift, and then you would add services back in to try to make it work. So immediately it became clear that we would have to add an officer and a sergeant back into the day and swing shift in order to even come reasonably close to where we were at before. It includes the sergeant and the motor officers in the analysis, as it did before. But it has another couple of features, and I'll let Jeff talk about this, or you can ask him questions. But it includes restores a common training day on Wednesday. So if you take a look at Wednesday in the chart there's no X's because everybody's working on that day. So if you're working 4 10s, that's 8 days. There's an extra day in there, so it's combined on Wednesday, so that pretty much everybody is working on Wednesday unless they have another reason to be off. It also allows employees to have one supervisor. So we only had 3 sergeants before. There's an additional sergeant in here, and as you can see, everything's stacking up nicely where you have one command or supervisor for each employee. And right now, things are moving all over the place. So there's not a lot of consistency, is my understanding, between who your supervisor is at any given time. There's some. And then it has so 2 10-hour shifts, day shift and swing shift, and the 5-hour sheriff patrol at night. And then if you add up the numbers, that's actually 25 hours. So you have 2 10-hour shifts and 1 5, so there's actually an overlap. And that overlap is actually between 1 and 2 in the morning. And I'll let Jeff kind of talk about that some. But that was really kind of the alternative patrol schedule that we came up and what we've kind of measured against as we come forward in the analysis. So do you have any questions for me or Jeff before we
Yes.
move on? Yes.
You have 1 officer and 1 sergeant. And below that, it's clarifying a sergeant and a motor officer. So does that exclude SRO?
Well, that's a great question. And if you look up there, I called it motor, and it's called traffic up there in the graph, in the chart. So that's good. So when we ran the analysis, when we looked at before, it included the SRO. When we ran the analysis, we did not include the SRO in the data. So the data you'll see does not include the SRO, and I have got a notation on that when we get to that sheet. So great question.
Let me add to that. So what you're looking at is a sample or an option for patrol deployment, and the sergeant and the traffic officer is a part of that mix, and the SROs, the detectives are not. So that's why you don't see them on that spreadsheet, because that's just showing the patrol folks. So don't look at this and think that there's no SROs. It's just that they're not as a part of the patrol deployment. So as Tom said, this was in working through this process, the question came up, well, what would be some options that you could do? And so I just put this together as just one option of what something could look like, using the resources that were freed up between 1 and 6, shifting them into other areas. So that's where that came from. And I just, simple math, 6 to 4, 4 to 2. And so that's why that overlaps there. You could do a lot of different variations to this, of course. One of which being you could move the overlap to between the two shifts, so it could be 6 to 4 and 3 to 1. I mean, we could do any number of different things with that, but I just went by the clock, so to speak, and went 6 to 4 to 4 to 2. And there could be some usefulness for that, because then at 1 o'clock when the other units take over, those that are getting ready to go home would have time to finish reports and so on and so forth if need be. But anyway, that's how that came about.
So, and I see where you're going, Councilor Robinson, and really what this analysis and data that we were looking at was really patrol. We want to make sure at least the officers on the streets are being compared. And so that's a priority. We'll talk about all the other positions as well when we get to the financial portion of this and how those services can get added back in. But really was trying to focus on the patrol staffing so that we could make sure that we weren't damaging something by adding something. So that was it. These are the same notes. Really this is just the alternative schedule that you just saw put into a table form. The one note that I'll make is that I did apply a 0.72 factor, so that's why you don't see whole numbers up there. And that's because from the matrix study and from everybody else, we know that people take PTO. We know that they're have sick time or vacation time or whatever. So really, they're only available 72% of the time, which is pretty standard in the industry and what.
And it correlates with the shift differential.
And it does actually correlate directly with the shift differential, which I noticed as well. So that's really a pretty common factor, but I wanted to make sure that we took that into account so that we weren't overcounting, because if you remember, we're comparing this to the June schedule, which was an actual schedule, and there was a lot of, if you looked at the schedule, there was a lot of time that people were out, as they typically are on any month. So those are the raw numbers. And then this is really what the analysis kicked out. So, what surprised me was when we took the overlaps away, I expected to see some big differences when we had the shifts when they were overlapping. But that really didn't pan out. It actually showed up being pretty good. And I'm using exactly the same, color scheme or the same percentages to take a look at the different colors you have here. But what you're seeing is a lot less green, at night, a lot less red, a little bit more yellow. But what happened is with this schedule is it really just balanced everything out. Where you were having those hot spots, because you either had too many officers or not enough, kind of just spread itself out over the entire schedule. And it ends up, being something that actually looks like it performs pretty well. So I actually have a slide here that compares before and after. So these are really, kind of the two alternatives that we looked at. So on the left, you have the June 2016 deployment, which was the actual, and on the right, you have the schedule that Jeff put together, which I just showed you. So, obviously this is just data. This isn't real world. So there may be some things that are surprises or not anticipated, but it does show you that at least there appears, from a data perspective, to be options that do provide that patrol service that actually works well. So if you look on the left again, you can see the shift overlaps. And if you look on the graph on the right, you'll see those shift overlaps go away, except for in the morning from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in the morning, where swing shift and the sheriff are on at the same time. So this was really kind of just, to be, not a perfect analysis, but at least analysis to say, okay, does this make sense? I mean, is there something here that Matrix was suggesting that potentially could work? And so this is kind of, after a lot of work and a lot of different alternatives that we looked at, kind of where we ended up is something that to present to you tonight. So now I'm going to kind of move into the cost piece, because obviously there's two pieces of this. There's the patrol, making sure that that we can come up with a schedule that actually works now that you're adding a partial schedule in. But then also there are cost implications. So I'm going to kind of start walking through that next. So the first thing is, obviously in all these scenarios, the night shift is eliminated. That was a part of the matrix recommendation. And you can see that you're talking about 4 officers and a flex officer, which is Judd Moore, who actually is really an officer, but he's just working flex shifts. So his costs weren't the same. So we accounted for that separately. We have some graveyard differential, which is different than what the sheriff office was talking about. This is really just the differential that they get because they're working in a graveyard shift at night. Materials and services, we just basically took the standard amount of ammunition and other type of items that we could. Those costs are probably higher, as well as the indirect costs, but it doesn't matter because we're taking out and adding back, so they cancel each other out. But this is really, if you just eliminate the night shift, there's a savings of $570,194. Obviously, you can't just eliminate the night shift and survive. So the next one is going to talk about adding things back. So we actually ran a couple of different scenarios, and one is kind of the highest service scenario is what we're calling it. And this is getting back to your questions, Councilor Robinson, about what are we adding back. So existing, there's 25.5 full-time employees in the police department. This high service scenario maintains that 25.5 FTE and adds the 0.875 FTE from the sheriff's office. And you can see in the chart there that we have a current minus the night shift, and then option 1, which is mislabeled, really is adding those pieces back. So no new additions, captain or chief, but we are showing adding 1 admin assistants / community service personnel back into the schedule, 1 sergeant, which was shown in the data analysis, and 1 police officer back into the schedule. I think those both went into the swing shift, if I'm correct. Well, at least the police officer went in the swing shift. The sergeant actually kind of balanced things out because now you have a sergeant for every shift. So, and then we're also showing 2 special assignments, so SRO or detective, that are getting added in this. So that's a total of 5 that you're adding back in. And the one thing that I'll mention is it's costly to do that, so it would require a budget change if this was the path that we were going to go down. Yes, ma'am.
Why do we need a full-time administrative assistant community service person?
Well, I can let Jeff talk about this, but I don't know that we've decided on anything that what this is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
This was just kind of trying to run different scenarios and see, what would be the highest amount of service that we could possibly get and what would that cost us. There's all sorts of different kinds of decisions that may get made about, where these actually end up, but we wanted to at least give you a couple of different options to think about. And, this one of the community service in particular was something in the matrix study. So that was one thing that we considered. And if you want a more detailed answer, I can have Jeff do that to you. But
That's what I was going to say, is both of those were mentioned as recommendations by Matrix.
so again, these are just scenarios. This isn't going to be, I don't think, where we end up, but we at least want to be able to present something to you so you can see, different options. If you add, these are the costs to add those back. So really you're adding 1 police officer, 2 special assignments, 1 sergeant, 1 admin assistant / community services person, and then the materials and service and indirect costs associated with those. And like I said, those just really canceled each other out in the last 2. And here's where you end up. So if you are to add in the sheriff office services, and then take away the night shift, and then add back in the additions that we just talked about, depending on which proposal that the sheriff gave us. You can see the different numbers. So at the top is the 2.1 FTE proposal. The second one is 1.75 FTE proposal, and the third one is a 0.875 FTE proposal. So really shouldn't be a whole lot of surprise, especially if you look at the last one there. If you the sheriff officer services cost $146,000. You save $577 by getting rid of the night shift, but you're adding $575 back, and you end up just about exactly what the sheriff's officer services cost. And that's because we basically kept the same amount of FTE in the police department and just added the sheriff's service on top. So very convoluted way to get there, but just wanted to show you the different possibilities there. So we also then took a look at what we're calling a neutral cost scenario. So rather than trying to maximize the amount of services that we can, try to get that bottom line number closer to where our budget authority is and approval is. So existing 25.5 FTE in the police department. This scenario changes it to 4.5 FTE in the police department, and adding the 0.875 FTE from the sheriff's office. I just made a note. Currently, there's 3 vacant positions. I want to make sure that everybody understands nobody's losing their job. If you were to do this, we would still be reallocating those officers that we have. You just wouldn't be filling a position that is currently open if you did this. Now, there's, again, a bunch of different ways you can run the allocations of what you're adding back. In this particular case, we only added 1 special assignment back in. So that's why that number there, 3, is highlighted. If you remember the other one, there was actually 4. And really, that's the only difference between these scenarios. But when you run that out, you have costs of $450,000, and you can see all of a sudden you start getting much closer to where our current budget's at. So, the 1.75 FTE, you'd have to find $165,000 in order to do that. Or if you go with the 0.875 FTE, there would only be a difference of $20,000. So really, that's kind of what we've done so far. And there's a lot of information there, and I don't know exactly, what you think, or what you think maybe we can do more of. But I have some questions that I'd like to ask of you. But before I do, what questions do you guys have for us?
Council? Any questions? Linda?
Honestly, I don't know where to start. Having not seen this till tonight.
Well, there's a tremendous
Yeah,
amount of
it's a lot.
data here.
Yeah, I
so-
know. So if we go to page 7, and when you mean by questions, I don't know if you meant general questions or,
Yeah, I think
I
at this
mean,
point, I think it would be,
or if you were just talking about the last slide.
no, at this point, I'm actually ready to try to ask some wrap-up questions and figure out where we want to go from here. So any questions you have on the presentation would be great.
So, sheriffs chime in anytime. So what I don't know is the cost of WACA. I don't know what that cost is. If we're going to be covering that, obviously the sheriff proposals, they do their own radio, their uniform, the body armor, which I understand. But I don't know what that charge is. I have no idea what that charge is. I assume we're incurring it anyway, but I don't know what that is. The shift differential is almost 28%. What's our current shift differential for graveyard?
Well, it's important to distinguish exactly what that is. So,
Yeah.
remember, Chief Deputy Cook explained it, that it's that percentage of time that you don't have a full-time employee, and Tom covered it in
Sure.
his data. But we don't generally use the term shift differential for that. We don't, because we use that term for something else. So any full-time employee, if it's 1.0, right, one person, you actually get 0.75 out of that employee. And that's a rule that really kind of goes across the board in any organization or any department, assuming the person has time off abilities, the person has the ability to call in sick, the person, you're going to send them to training, so on and so forth. So that's what they're talking about. And so that shift differential of 27% means that they're calculating 73% of one FTE. That's really what it amounts to, which is, as Tom said, is very consistent to what Matrix published when they ran our numbers. I think we were at 0.72,
Yeah,
but
28%.
yeah, 28%. So it's all very consistent. So that's what that shift differential in their terminology means. That's why you have 0.875.
Right, and what they were doing is they were providing a dollar number to that, so that's why it's in this calculations, because they want to guarantee that there's somebody here, and they're going to have, if they were just to assign one person, 28% of their time is going to be not available, and they need to backfill that and make sure that there's somebody there. So they were monetizing that. When I went through my calculations, I was actually taking it out of the schedule so I could show how that would impact the schedule changes. But they're very similar numbers, even though they came from completely different sources.
Have we made sense of that yet?
They're similar numbers, but they come from completely different sources.
Yeah,
That
so
doesn't make any sense.
So
to me.
Matrix you figured out that roughly it was 28% of the time that someone isn't going to be available, or 72% of the time they were going to be available.
Right.
Washington County, from their research, has that is 27.619. So 27.6 is very close to 28.
So when you have a deputy working graveyard, they have a shift differential. It's in
No.
their contract.
No, so our shift differential has nothing to do with pay for working graveyard. Our shift differential, as it equates there, is your average deputy, that's how much time, 27% of the time, they're going to take off on FMLA, sick
Sure.
time, training, vacation. And that's what our shift differential is. Our deputies on graveyard get paid the same as our deputies on day shift.
So let me take another crack at this. So the way it works for us internally is we get, 0.72 out of the full-time position. We cover that in other ways. So when that person's off, we cover them with another officer that's assigned to the schedule. Some circumstances, we may cover by paying somebody overtime to work the schedule. But when you're talking about entering into an agreement, so when we're talking about a contract with the county, we're going to have to pay for that time that they're going to cover when the assigned person isn't there. It's not going to automatically happen. So that's why there's that monetary amount assigned to it. It's built into the agreement so that they're not out money making sure we have somebody assigned here all the time.
It's just an incremental cost for that one full-time person.
Right.
Initially.
And instead of, the other way to look at it is you could call it a 1.27 FTE if you wanted to, but they're actually counting actual bodies
Yes.
by going 0.875. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so I understand. So let's talk strictly salary and benefits. If there was a Sherwood officer in that 0.75 FTE, what would that far right number be on page 7? Here it's 95. Of course, that's only 5 hours a night, right? So if a Sherwood employee was working 5 hours a night in that 5.875 FTE, what would that number
Sure.
be?
So it's
Approximately.
it's 5 hours a night, but it's 7 days a week. So that's how it ends up being 0.875 FTE when you calculate it out. So
But we work 7 days a week too in Sherwood.
so
So I'm trying to understand their cost
Right.
versus our cost just on salary and benefits, like the sheriff mentioned. That's just a
Yeah,
fully
so-
accepted, understood cost.
Sure. So our standard 1 FTE is, somewhere between $115,000 and $120,000 is kind of the range. We used $113,000. But somewhere in there, $113,000, $120,000 is roughly what one FTE costs. I could multiply that by 0.875 and get your answer, but I don't have that number in my head. So
But this is only one employee working 5 hours a night. Correct?
Well,
Right?
no,
Seven days.
yeah.
7 days a week.
Right.
7 days a
well,
week. So it works out to
and-
being 0.875
Right.
FTE for that one person. So that'd be about $105,000, what our salary and benefits would be for a typical employee. So
The exact same coverage. Apples to apples.
For 5 hours a night? That doesn't make any sense to me, but,
well, You can't- yeah.
Actually looking at
right.
Right.
what salary I mean, you'd really have to compare the exact people,
Right.
employees, to be able to give you an accurate answer, unfortunately.
Right. And can I ask the sheriff's department, when's the last time you did a salary survey for your line officers?
We do that periodically. It's based on averages.
But is it something you do routinely, like once every 2 years, or?
I could not tell you the last time one was done, but we go through and evaluate our contracts periodically to make sure that those averages are still the averages of our deputies. So that's an average of all of our deputies.
Right, and I'm talking about like countywide. When do you do a salary survey to make sure you're appropriately keeping up with the market or paying your employees?
Usually,
you
when
know-
usually when the contracts come up.
We just went through contract negotiations with our association.
And that included a regionalized
Correct.
salary comparison?
Salary and benefits, the total packages, compensation packages are looked at for the represented deputies.
So I have a question. In that relational piece that Counselor Henderson was talking about, I want to make sure that I'm understanding this. So on page 7, the sheriff's office proposal, for the 1.75, which is the 2 sheriffs, it's 292,172, and that includes everything. So then you go to page 17, and the cost is, am I correct in understanding that the cost to us is 577,194 to,
no, so this is actually, if you're going to eliminate the entire night shift, this would approximate what it would cost. So because you're adding the sheriff in for 5 hours, you kind of need to eliminate the night shift in order to make things work. So what I'm doing here is I'm backing out the cost of our night shift estimated. So I used an officer cost of 113,000 in there. And then we, like I said, we have a flex officer, Judd, who doesn't work the same number of hours. So we backed him out separately. And then, the shift differential, what I should have used a different term because it doesn't relate at all, is really just the premium that we pay
Right.
to people to work the
That's
graveyard
actually the
shift.
salary difference.
That's correct.
between
Right,
shifts.
That's correct.
right?
Yeah.
So Mayor, you're basically talking on that, for that figure 577 and change, you're basically talking about 5.75 people.
Okay,
It's the entire, including a sergeant and all the
there's
officers.
an overlapping going on.
Well, that's the entire shift. What Tom did is took that entire shift.
Okay,
Yeah, and what I didn't do is I didn't take the sheriff out or the sergeant out because I knew we were adding it right back in. So it's
Oh,
not shown
got
in these numbers. So, but that's a good point.
So when it says 4 units, the chief just said 5.75.
Yes, it's 5 because I didn't take the sergeant out. So, so it's really five people is what it is. 4 officers, the flex officer and Judd, and then that's it.
But we actually only have 2 officers on at night with a sergeant, right?
Well, it depends on the night, but generally, yeah. I mean, Tom has those broken down, and you see the averages in that other chart. So some nights there's just 2 officers. Some nights there's an officer and a sergeant. Some nights there's 2 officers and a sergeant. Some, but what the shift averages out at, depending on the day and the time, you have on that chart.
It's on page 8, isn't it?
Yeah.
No. Yeah, it is. Thank you. So you can see it's anywhere 2.5, 3.4, 2.3.
1.8.
Yeah, I don't see where the 1.8 is. That's 5 o'clock in the afternoon, so that's not night shift.
Right.
We have a 2-car minimum to help explain that.
Right.
So we will always have 2 patrol cars. It could be 2 officers, sergeant and officer, but we'll always have 2 on 24/7. That's our minimum staffing.
Okay, so the sheriff's proposal, the 0.75, that's 1 officer, 1 car from midnight,
From 1 till.
1 till 6 a.m. So no 2-car backup, no 2-car standard.
That is correct.
And you would obviously call on other resources, other agencies if necessary.
That is correct.
So if, in this scenario, if you have 1 officer on and you have a DUI and the DUI needs to be processed, what happens? Nobody's patrolling, right?
Not at that point in time.
Yeah. And when you have somebody in custody, don't you have to have another officer in the building or something?
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay, I thought.
I mean, there may be circumstances where that's needed, but as a general rule, no.
Okay.
Assuming they're cooperative and
And so right now, when we make an arrest, an officer has to go to Washington County to take the person who's being arrested to the county, because we do not have a jail here.
correct.
Well,
That
unless
is a normal
Washington-
procedure
yeah.
in the Sherwood Police Department.
Would that be something that could change to where if they had 1 officer here, that someone would come here to pick up that person rather than leaving the jurisdiction?
During certain hours of the night, we have transport units on that currently service the city of Sherwood. And if those units are on, they would be able to do the same thing.
Because the only other benefit I see too is that there's always a supervisor every night, as opposed to some of our nights, we don't always have a supervisor on, so. But
And we utilize the transport officer now.
we do.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Staff's-
I mean, if we have 2 folks on, we want 2 folks on. If,
Right.
if we can get the transport officer to take custody, great. If not, then an officer drives to Hillsborough and there's an officer here by themselves.
Yeah, and the only reason I asked that is because when I did the ride-along, that's
Right.
what we did. We drove to Hillsborough because we arrested somebody
Mhm.
who will remain unnamed.
Wasn't me.
Other questions from council?
Okay, we've got a lot of information, I think,
Sure.
to go through.
Yeah, so I've got some kind of just some follow-up kind of next steps, if that's okay with you. So I guess, really, question number 1 is we've kind of spent, a lot of time putting this together to see if there's a possibility if something could work. And it gave you that information tonight. And, you might not be ready to answer that question tonight, but I guess does council want to continue to study matrix recommendation number 6? I mean, is there enough information there that we've given you to say, okay, well, maybe there is something here, or this is just, something that isn't going to work or isn't going to work for us, and let's stop.
Council?
Well, I need time to process this. I'm gonna have a lot of questions between here and the other.
Yeah.
Okay.
So why don't we, Tom, just a suggestion, go through the questions that
Sure.
you want to lay out, knowing that you need some time
Right.
to absorb this, really think about it, ask questions. and work session.
And then we'll know what questions you need answered at the work session.
Yeah.
The first one
These are
is
the
yes.
questions staff.
Yes.
as we
So,
think
so
about
I guess the first
staff.
question answer would be yes, because we do want to think about it and
Okay.
talk about it. And
And that's fair enough. So I'll just go through all the other questions because you aren't going to be able to answer any of them as well because really there's a ton of information here and I completely understand that you guys just need time to digest it. So as you're thinking through it though, what would be helpful for us to know if there are other scenarios that you would like us to consider, either from a financial perspective or a staffing perspective. Does council want more analysis from an outside consultant? We've done what we can with the tools we have, But if you want a deeper dive into some of those bigger questions, as far as length of call for services and those other things, that would take a more robust analysis than we can provide in-house. And then finally, do you want additional public involvement process to kind of talk about this more with the public if this is something we decide to move forward with? So.
All right. Well, I want to thank the sheriffs for coming. I sure appreciate everything that you've done to present this to us, and we're going to keep milling it over and talking some more amongst ourselves, but we really appreciate you considering forming, this partnership, which we really already have, because we already go to your jail. Thank you.
So just.
Yes, yes.
Are we adjourned or not?
Yes. Yeah, we're adjourned.
Can I just make
Oh, okay. All right, we are unadjourned.
So, when we meet to talk about future council agendas,
Yes.
we'll talk about future dates to continue this work session.
Yes.
I think I really want to stress to counselors when I send my weekly report out with that, look at that, where we have it scheduled, and make sure that we have enough time so it's robust. I would prefer to do it before the regular meeting rather than after, when folks are tired and it's been a long day.
Right, right.
But you have a fairly busy schedule in September, October, and early November, so
Okay. All right. Well, thank you,
now you can
and
adjourn.
we are adjourned.